Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about common knowledge and research. So if you've ever taken a university writing course or even many high school writing courses, you will have been told to cite your sources. And I've made videos on this channel about citing your sources. I've made videos about how to use 8th edition MLA, which is now the second most recent edition. You should see a link up, I think, in that corner, possibly in that corner, to my video about that. I've made videos about using in-text citations. I've made any number of videos in which I remind you to cite sources. But one of the exceptions to that rule is what we call common knowledge. So in this video, we'll talk about what common knowledge is, how you figure out whether a piece of information counts as common knowledge, and why you want to be aware of this. So basically, in my thinking, there are two major types of common knowledge. One is general common knowledge, and one is common knowledge in a particular field. So when we're talking about general common knowledge, this is basically information that anyone across the board could reasonably be expected to know. Things that non-specialists in a discipline could reasonably be expected to be familiar with. So, the Earth is round. The United States declared independence from Britain in 1776. Vincent van Gogh painted Starry Night. These are things that, generally speaking, if you stopped someone on the street, you might reasonably expect them to know. So that's information that you wouldn't have to cite. The second version of this would be information that a person in your particular field, so for me that would be English literature or drama studies, adaptation studies, a person in one of those fields might reasonably be expected to know, even if a general person, a non-specialist in that field, could not reasonably be expected to know it. So, you would expect, for instance, that someone in the field of English literature would know what a metaphor is. You would expect that they would know what a sonnet is. You would expect that they would know some of the basic principles of, for instance, Marxist theory. So these are things that you could reasonably be expected, you could reasonably figure your readers are already going to have that information. So that's one important way of looking at common knowledge. Is it something that most people likely are already familiar with? Now, what makes that important? Well, there's a couple of things. One is that with common knowledge, you don't necessarily have to do as much to establish the validity of that argument. So you don't need to, if you're writing, say, a paper about physics, you don't necessarily need to prove that E equals mc squared. That's something that within that field you can reasonably infer that most people will already be aware of and will probably already agree on. I think. I don't know physics, but you know what I'm saying. So that means that you need to do a lot less evidence to prove that if you want to use that as a claim or as a piece of evidence. If it's something that people can reasonably be assumed to already accept as true, then you can generally use it to support your own arguments without having to do a massive amount of providing additional evidence for it. The other reason that that's important, the second reason that common knowledge is important, is because if it's something that readers can already be expected to know and believe, it's unlikely to be anyone's individual intellectual property. So that's actually the other major way of looking at common knowledge as well, is does this idea, does this point belong to someone? Is this something that an individual developed on their own, or is this something that, because it's broadly accepted, no longer needs to be specifically attributed to an individual? The methodology of close reading, for instance, in English. We have it. It was developed by a specific group of people, but it's now such a widespread technique that, for instance, you wouldn't need to necessarily attribute close reading or a close reading to the originators of that theory, the Russian formalists, the new critics in the US, the Prague School, etc., etc. So what the upshot of that is that if something is common knowledge, it doesn't need to be cited. Now, you may end up citing it, or you may end up citing multiple sources to bolster your claim by drawing from their authority, but if a point is something that's common knowledge, then you don't need to cite it because it's not an individual's intellectual property. It's something that is generally shared either across society or within that field. So, how do you figure out if something is common knowledge? Well, one of the quickest and dirtiest ways of doing so is if you can find it in 3 to 5 sources where those authors are treating this information as common knowledge, then it likely is common knowledge. Not always. There are particular pieces of information that individual clusters of people may know, that, like specialists. So, for instance, I recently did I did a lot of research for an article, a book chapter, rather, about a play from an Egyptian playwright named Ali Salim. There are a lot of pieces of information that you get across the board among people who are writing about Egyptian drama, but even though that information is very commonly shared, it's only commonly shared among that very narrow group of people. Drama scholars in general are much less likely to be aware of that information, and so you want to be cautious about the scope of the general knowledge. So if I were sending this chapter out, so my book is my second book, which this chapter is going to go into, is going to be addressed to theater studies people and classical receptions or adaptation studies people. Most of them will not be familiar with these things that are common knowledge among scholars of Egyptian drama. And so that's something you need to be very cautious about when determining whether or not something is common knowledge, is you want to figure out for whom is it common knowledge. And this is where you may run into a pitfall with the 3 to 5 sources approach, although that's generally a pretty good way of going about it. Another approach to figuring out if something is common knowledge would be to look at secondary or even tertiary sources. So that might be things like textbooks, encyclopedias, places where original research, original arguments are not being presented, but that are trying to reflect some sort of consensus or some sort of general view. The information in, say, an Encyclopedia Britannica or something like this is almost never going to be someone's intellectual property because that the individual wording is. So if you're using their language directly, make sure that you are citing that source. But if you're just drawing on the idea, then that's unlikely to be someone's intellectual property, because encyclopedias, which are tertiary sources, collect up material that reflects a general consensus about that subject. And so that's something that you want to be aware of within your particular field, but also in general, what constitutes common knowledge and how do you have to approach citing it? Because again, if it's common knowledge, if it's not someone's intellectual property, then it doesn't inherently need a citation, although you may find one useful. So, if you determine that something is common knowledge, go ahead and feel free to use it without a citation. But again, I'm gonna repeat something that you may have also been told in your university writing classes. It's better to oversight than to undercite. So if you're not sure if something is common knowledge, go ahead and put a citation on